Tonight, we have 5 shorter stories, but don't worry. Each one of these stories packs a whole lot of terror in a short time frame. From a group of friends exploring a pumpkin patch at night, a mysterious ATM, a strange teacher, and more. A huge thank you to tonight's writers for allowing me to share these stories with all of you. Without them, this video would not have been possible. If you have a story of your own and would like to share it with the channel, it can be submitted at my subreddit r/slumberreads. Please be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Stay safe out there, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Every year, starting in September, Mrs. Mulligan's pumpkin patch opened for business. Kids and adults alike loved it there, and Nikki, Quinn, and I were no exception. While it was relatively small, Mrs. Mulligan's had a lot to offer. There was a little kiddie haunted house, and another one for bigger kids and adults. There was a sweet shop, and a turkey leg stand, and best of all, the patch itself. Mrs. Mulligan knew how to grow pumpkins. They were huge and round, and always healthy. Whenever anyone asked how she did it, she would answer with, "It's all in the fertilizer." September 22nd, 1983. Mrs. Mulligan's had opened a week before, and being the troublesome 13-year-olds we were, Mickey, Quinn, and I came up with a plan to break in. We were curious to find all of the little secrets in Mrs. Mulligan's, and the thought of having the entire patch to ourselves was quite enticing. We would buy a pass for the day and camp out in the bathrooms until everyone left. That morning was magical. We gorged ourselves on turkey legs, and then forced cookies and sticky caramel apples down until we thought we would burst. We went through the kitty haunted house and laughed at all the babies who cried at the plastic skeletons hung up. The grown-up haunted house was my favorite. It was a decaying farmhouse, ridged with slamming doors, giant animatronic roaches, and actors who would jump out at you from nowhere. The scariest room in that house was the bathroom. The lights would flicker, and the medicine cabinet would slam open and shut. Fake roaches would crawl up from the sink's drain. The bathtub was filled with fake blood, and a rotting corpse laid floating in it. Needless to say, that room made me shit my pants. After we got done with that, we took a hay rack ride. The tractor dropped us off in the field, and we wandered about, admiring the pumpkins. We didn't end up grabbing any, simply because we would be there the rest of the night. The rest of the night passed with ease, and eventually, it was time to put the plan in action. I'm honestly surprised we weren't caught, considering we were cracking jokes and laughing the whole time. When we finally left the bathroom, we couldn't decide where to go. Nikki wanted to go to the patch, but Quinn wanted to go to the farmhouse. I didn't really care, so we flipped a coin to settle it. Quinn called heads, and that's what the coin landed on. Off to the farmhouse we went. The house was even creepier at night. There was only us and the buzzing of the electricity. We could hear the fake bugs skittering every so often, and I remember being grossed out. Nikki was the one who came up with the idea to split up. It would be more exciting that way, he said. I was reluctant, but after being called a chicken, I worked up enough nerve. Mickey took to exploring the living room. Quinn went to the kitchen, and I, for whatever reason, went to the bathroom. A fluorescent light flickered when I entered. I glanced around the room, thinking about how much worse it was at night. I headed towards the bathtub, extended my arm to peel back the bloody shower curtain. Suddenly, the medicine cabinet slammed shut behind me. It caught me so off guard that I stumbled forward, falling into the blood-filled bathtub. I scrambled to get up, and in my panic, stuck my hand right into the corpse's open mouth. I let out a scream. I swear that thing felt way too real. I jolted backwards, almost slipping because of the fake blood on my shoes. I regained my balance and turned on my heels and ran. I yelled for Nikki and Quinn as I bolted out of the front door. I did not want to be in that house for a single second more. Quinn was the first to see me. Jesus, man, what happened to you? I remember him asking. I told him the truth, but they just laughed. They called me a chicken again, squawking at me for getting so worked up. As my heart slowed down, I started to get embarrassed. Yeah, whatever. Let's just get to the patch and get out of here. This shit's sticky, I said. And so we headed to the patch. We stumbled around in the dark for a while, occasionally tripping over vines. We spread out, searching for the right pumpkin. I watched as Nikki stooped over a particularly large one. "Jake, come help me with this," he yelled to me, wriggling the pumpkin around. It took the two of us to lift it, but Nikki insisted on being the one to carry it. As we walked back to Quinn, Nikki tripped over a vine and dropped our pumpkin. "Shit," he exclaimed as it burst into pieces. I stood still in horror as I watched blood pour out of the broken pumpkin. Nikki screamed, and that was my cue to start running. Quinn, who still had no idea what had happened, followed close behind. We didn't stop until we were out of the patch. Later that night, we called in an anonymous tip to the police. We said we believed someone was in danger and to investigate the patch thoroughly. A day later, the story came out in the news. Dead bodies were found buried deep beneath the pumpkins. It turns out Mrs. Mulligan had been using them to fertilize her prized pumpkins the whole time. Perhaps the most scarring piece of information was what they found in the farmhouse. The corpse that everyone thought was a prop was actually the dead body of a missing hitchhiker. And the fake blood actually wasn't fake at all. I felt a sting on my back as I woke up with a jolt. Looking up, I realized that my teacher had hit my shoulder blade with a ruler in order to wake me up. Wearing a scowl on his face, he watched my eyes as he silently put some papers on my desk. The class groaned as Mr. Walter handed out our assignment for today and returned to his desk. We had a test this week, and we had received a 6-page packet for review. I estimated it would take me at least 2 hours, maybe 3, to complete. Looking up from my desk and back up at the board, I noticed that our teacher had returned to the front of the room and was playing a video on the screen. The video, which was a review of our lesson from 3 days ago, had been pulled up on YouTube. At my particular high school, you could say Mr. Walter was a bit of an enigma. Being the only calculus teacher at my school, everyone who has ever graduated in the last 13 years surely would have remembered taking his class. Not because he was a good teacher, nor because he was a horrible one. He remained a mystery because he never spoke. Not once. Not only did he never speak, nobody ever saw him leave the school. And as our school provided no food for the teachers, except for the cafeteria at lunchtime, which was only for the students, the teachers were expected to bring their food from outside, which meant that Mr. Walter never had food or water. Many kids just wrote him off as weird or simply a freak, but I knew that either they were wrong about his habits, or I had a great misunderstanding of the things the human body needed to survive. Which is why after finishing my homework at 11 p.m. that night, I decided to return to the school. On the outside of the building, I looked in through Mr. Walter's classroom window. There was nobody inside. The coast was clear. I knew the windows were unlocked at my school in case of emergency, so I slowly, carefully, was able to open the window from outside and slip right through into the room. Once inside, I immediately set out to do my task. I creeped over to Mr. Walter's large desk and opened the top left drawer. My eyes were met with a stack of test papers. Closing the drawer, I opened the one to its right and saw a stack of calculus homework papers. The next drawer contained yet more calculus papers. I was beginning to get disheartened, but then I realized that the next drawer was locked. I pulled on it with all my might, but the lock was pretty sturdy. After grabbing a paper clip from Mr. Walter's desk, I unfolded it and attempted to pick the lock. The lock wouldn't budge. I kept trying. Come on, come on. As if to meet my request, I heard a click, and the drawer flew open. My jaw immediately dropped. The top paper in the cabinet had a pentagram drawn on it. Under it were several Latin words in red ink. I hastily looked through all the papers in the drawer. There were dozens of them, all with various demonic symbolism and Latin words under it. I dropped the papers, slammed the cabinet shut, and sprinted out to the hallway. Beads of sweat ran down my face and neck. My heart was pounding as I turned the next corner. I froze. Mr. Walter was walking down the hallway, away from me. When he heard me step into the hall, he stopped where he was standing. What are you? He didn't respond, but I slowly began to feel the world stop moving. It was like time itself slowed down to a halt, where before I could hear cars driving on the road outside and crickets chirping, it was like they were slowing down and then stopping. After what felt like hours of me staring at the back of my teacher's head from about 10 paces away, I noticed I couldn't move. Even though I willed my muscles with every fiber of my being to run away from the danger, I knew that my body was being held in place by a force beyond this plane of reality. Suddenly, all the lights went out. Everything was pitch black, and not even the moonlight shining through the glass door at the end of the long hallway was enough for me to see. As quickly as it came, the darkness was gone, and was replaced by a dark red light, like you would see in a photography room. Unlike a photography room, however, the light wasn't coming from anywhere. It seemed to just permeate the hallway without emanating from any specific place. And then I noticed Mr. Walter. He was in the same position, not farther, not closer, to me than he was before the lights went out. The only difference was, now, he was facing me. If I could have moved my lips, I would have screamed for help. His eyes had no irises. All I could see were the pupils, which were like tiny pinpoints in the center of his eye, and the rest was white. His mouth was drawn up at the corners in a vicious smile. It would have looked normal, except that, other than his teeth, his mouth was like a large, black void. Mr. Walter then began shrieking without moving his mouth. The sound was a cross between a baby crying and an eagle screeching. It was like nails on a chalkboard, and, as if the noise was a demand for all others to bow down to him, all of the lockers began opening and closing rapidly. Inside all of the lockers, all that was visible was a black void. Still screeching, Mr. Walter rose several inches off the ground. There were no strings attached to him. There was no hidden lever. No. He was hovering up off the ground, defying gravity in doing so. Mr. Walter shot across the hallway like a bullet, aimed at me. I instinctively tried to cover my face, but it was like I was floating in syrup. I couldn't move my muscles. When he hit me, all went black. The sharp rap of a ruler on my shoulder blade woke me up. My head jerked upwards, and my heart was still pounding. Everyone was staring at me. On the board, the YouTube calculus lesson was still playing. I must have been dreaming. It's not real. It's not real. Calm down. My heart gradually began to slow down. I took it as a lesson that my brain had wanted to give me, or something, and that it wasn't possible for anything to be wrong with our teacher, that it would defy reality if he never ate or slept, and that I was just paranoid. When the class finally ended, I had decided not to watch so many horror movies. Before I could walk out the door and enjoy the weekend, however, I felt Mr. Walter's hand on my shoulder. He kept me until everyone else had left the classroom. What he said to me, the only thing I've ever heard him say, still keeps me up at night. You keep falling asleep in class, Tim. If it continues to happen, there may be more serious consequences. I doubt it'll come to that. Also, I hope you've learned your lesson. If you try to solve questions, you might find answers. I was sitting in the queue at my local bar, waiting to order my long overdue relief from work, when I realized I had no cash. I sighed, irritated that I would have to give up my spot, and stepped out of the line. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the walls for the telltale signs of metal. I desperately hoped to see an ATM, but I knew from past adventures in this hole in the wall that there were no machines to be found. I begrudgingly stepped out of the door, feeling the brisk air uncomfortably embrace me like a distant relative at a family reunion. I shuddered, yanking my jacket tighter until it held me in an ironclad hug. The wind howled, threatening my tentative stance on the pavement, and I tugged at my beanie. The street was barren, completely devoid of life. The usually busy road had a twisted air of lifeless melancholy, and the wind howled just to fill the silent air that drifted in a dead hang. A small jolt of electricity shot through my veins, as I remembered spotting an ATM on the way to the bar. I quickly started to walk in the direction where I saw it, rubbing my hands together with a mirthless intensity as I moved. I walked for about 5 minutes before turning into the alleyway where the ATM resided. I let out a sigh of relief as I pulled my wallet from my jean pocket and fiddled with the buttons, anxious to return to the warm and lively environment of the bar. At long last, the machine spit out the money into the waiting tray, and I reached to grab it. I pocketed my money, but before I could turn away, the machine shot out a hand. Without thinking, I extended my arm and firmly grasped the waiting hand in front of me. I mumbled a thanks, and releasing the hand from my grip, turned around to walk to the bar. I made it about halfway down the alley before my brain caught up. I froze in disbelief and turned back to glance at the machine. Behind me was another man, decidedly grumpy and less than sober, withdrawing cash from the machine. He shouted insults and expletives at the ATM, cursing at the speed with which the machine functioned, and aggressively reached for his money. With lightning-fast movements, the machine shot out its arm, grabbing the man's wrist, and retreated with a frightening velocity. The man let out a shriek of surprise and terror as the machine yanked his squirming body through the tiny hole. I squeezed my eyes shut as I heard the sickening splash of warm, wet liquid soaking the pavement. When I opened my eyes again, I was met with the unmistakable sight of blood and guts splattered across the rundown road. I sighed, shaking my head, and turned to walk back to the bar. There's something wrong with the walls of my apartment. I only noticed it yesterday. I was sitting in front of my laptop, watching something on Netflix, when movement caught my eye on the wall behind the screen. I blinked, pausing my show and squinting in the dark, sure I was going to have to kill a bug. Grabbing a crumpled, oily napkin from the clutter on my desk, I prepared to strike, only to pause, confused, when my eyes adjusted. There was nothing there. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light, letting the napkin fall back onto the desk. No bug after all. My piece lasted for about 5 minutes. Once again, I saw movement at the edge of my vision. I rubbed my eyes and stood this time, using my phone as a flashlight to illuminate the wall. Nothing. I pressed my palm to the wall, wondering if some of the paint was flaking off and catching my eye. To my surprise, heat radiated out of the normally cool surface. I jerked my hand back in surprise, cursing softly. That couldn't be good. The wall behind my desk was shared with the apartment next door. Was my neighbor's place on fire or something? I leaned in close to the wall, my ear less than an inch from its warmth, but I couldn't hear anything. I tried Googling what a hot wall meant, just in case it was something terminal, but my search returned a multitude of possible explanations that ranged from poor insulation to faulty wiring. Mentally shrugging, I decided it was something that could be handled tomorrow, and resolved to let the landlord know in the morning. The next day, I sat back down on my laptop with a bowl of cereal, ready to watch more Netflix. I haven't exactly been leaving my apartment much these days, to be honest. I spend a lot of my time in front of my laptop. I'm only telling you this so you understand. The days were blurring together and losing distinction, and the weirdness of the previous night had faded into monotony for me. I had finished my cereal by the time I noticed anything was wrong. I was clearing a spot for my empty bowl when I finally saw it. In the soft brightness of morning, I could see a slight undulation in the surface of the wall. A momentary expansion and retraction that I would have missed if I wasn't looking right at it. I blinked in shock. The movement wasn't on the wall, it was in the wall. The events of the night before came rushing back to me. Was there something trapped in there? Maybe a nest of mice or something, I thought. which may even explain the heat I had felt. I let my hand settle against the warmth of the wall. The heat was uncomfortable, but not quite hot enough to burn. I didn't have long to think about the temperature though, because when I pressed my palm a little harder into the wall, it gave way. It didn't crumple inward or splinter from force. Instead, it felt like raw meat beneath my fingers, damp and oozing and malleable. I yanked my hand away and wiped it frantically on my sweatshirt. The damp patches it left behind smelled so strongly of rot that I couldn't make it to the sink before throwing up violently. I ripped the sweatshirt over my head and threw it to the floor, covering my mouth with my arm to get away from the rancid smell. When I could finally catch my breath without feeling sick again, I looked back to the wall. Now, in the spot where my palm had been, the wall bulged out like an overripe trash bag, a swollen tumor pushing outward and dripping sizzling discharge onto my desk. Heart pounding in my throat, I grabbed my laptop and retreated to the opposite corner of the room, only to leap away as I felt the burning heat of the far wall. I stumbled to the front door and tried to pull it open, but the searing walls had fused with the wood of the door. With a shudder, I realized it could have been fused shut for days. I hadn't left my apartment in nearly a week. I ran to my windows, trying them each in turn, but they were all stuck tightly shut as well. I grabbed a nearby table and started to throw it at a window, hoping it would break the glass. But as I reared back, the window sagged under the weight of the wall above them and began to cloud and melt. In a matter of seconds, I could no longer see the sky. All around me, the walls of my apartment began to swell, like a corpse in water. I bloated with a slow, mindless determination, and I sank to the floor in despair. There was no other way out of my apartment. I was trapped. The walls didn't close in exactly. They didn't shrink like a sliding puzzle, still a neat box with sharp corners. They oozed, bulbous and pushing outward, sagging into my floor and spreading into every crevice of my apartment. The once rigid drywall was flimsy and porous like thin sausage casing, sizzling with every new surface it came into contact with. If I looked at it too long, I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, pressing up against the membrane in a feeble attempt at freedom. That was yesterday. Now, I am huddled in the middle of my apartment, with barely any room left to move. The walls are boiling to the touch. I accidentally nudged one with my toe a couple hours ago. I can't really feel the pain anymore, but I can still smell the charred flesh. The crumbling ceiling sags and distends towards me and singes the tops of my flyaway hairs. My laptop is running low on battery now. I've tried to use it to call for help, but I don't think anyone or anything can reach me now. It's much too late. The walls are reaching out for me, the shapes within them pressing more firmly against the delicate skin. I can only smell rotten smoke, and I dread the moment the wafer-thin skin splits and the decay in my walls claims me. When I was young, my stepdad had a terrible temper. Often, listening closely through the walls of our trailer was the difference between a good night and a bad one. If I knew he was coming, I could start cleaning or maybe hide. I guess this habit of listening followed me into adulthood. My fiancé is a kind, gentle man. He has never made me feel unsafe or unloved. Yet, I can't shake the habit. When we moved into our apartment, that feeling of freedom was intoxicating. Neither of us had a place of our own before. I spent at least 100 hours in Hobby Lobby, picking out decorations and a big rug for the living room. If I had known then. I can't help but to think this is silly, but my mom always said writing was therapeutic and sometimes does help me sleep. Anyway, when we first moved in, Nate set up our office in the spare bedroom. He played video games on his computer in the evenings with the door cracked, and I set up my reading nook in the living room. The first week or two were perfect. Then, our neighbors moved in downstairs. You would think that living on the second floor meant we wouldn't have to deal with noise complaints. Boy, were we wrong. It started with music. Weird opera music playing at midnight, or later would wake me up in the middle of the night. Nate sleeps like the dead, so he would never notice. How many times did I think about going downstairs and kicking their door in? Don't they know people have to be up early for work? I complained in the morning when Nate noticed the dark rings around my eyes, but he always talked me down. If it happens again, he'd say, I'll handle it. It's not his fault, really. He's never been one to handle confrontation well. Eventually, he just didn't believe me. After all, I was the only one who heard it. Then, they started fighting, and not just at nights either. Even the evenings when I was reading, and Nate was in Discord with his friends, I would hear them. The woman, she had this terrible moan when she cried. It felt as if their fighting vibrated the floor under my feet. I tried to block it out, too. I wore headphones, turned on the TV, even went for walks when possible. Still, I heard her sobs, and the banging. Sometimes I was afraid that the worst was happening. Ghosts from my childhood crept in through the walls every night when the sun chased the horizon. The shadows grew longer, and the noises began. It wasn't long before I wasn't sleeping at all. Every time I drifted off, a crash. I could hear glass breaking or someone falling. My nerves were a wreck, and poor Nate. I'm afraid he got the worst of it. That night, the bad night, I woke up again around 1 a.m. The banging was so bad that I finally woke him up. I knew he was getting tired of my complaining, but god damn it, I just wanted sleep. I made him go down and knock on their door to make sure everything was okay. Of course they didn't answer, but like I said, Nate isn't one for confrontation, so he probably just knocked all polite. I was so fed up, I went down and banged on the door. I banged and banged until I forced an answer. Only wouldn't you know it, no one was there. The door swung open with a whoosh, as if I had just pushed it open. The living room was dark, and there was only a chair in the far corner, and a ladder set up in the middle of the room. Convinced that my neighbors were hiding in their back room, I dared to step inside. My anger still fueled me. Though the bare living room did make me question my motives a bit. To the right, the hallway spanned deep into the darkness. There was a glow coming out of what I assumed was the bedroom. Maybe a nightlight or the TV. I took a step into the hall, but I couldn't make myself go any further. All at once, I felt like the room behind me was filled with people, and their eyes were burrowing holes into my back. I had never felt such an extreme presence of malevolence. I turned around and, of course, there was no one there. But from the hall I heard her footsteps start to run toward me. The pounding of her feet pushed my body into motion and I jumped out the door. I don't remember shutting it, but I heard the door slam, so someone must have. When Nate saw my face, he thought they had hurt me. But when I tried to explain, something changed in his complexion. I reached to grab his hands, but he pushed my arms aside. Stop, Lacey. You've got to stop. He ran a hand through his hair and spun around. I'm going to stay at Mom's. You have to get some sleep. He grabbed his keys and was gone. I wish I could say I begged him to stay, but the words were stuck in my throat. That was 3 nights ago, and though I haven't slept, I've got to say I feel remarkably better. The music comes at midnight, and they've changed the tone to an upbeat sort of waltz. The woman, she doesn't cry as much. I swear she might even be singing. Nate is gone and I feel kind of lonely. I think she might need company. Maybe I can go meet the neighbors. I've heard so much through the walls.